Welcome to my latest YouTube video. I'm Rosenberg, the author of The Human Magnet Syndrome and the creator of the Codependency Cure. I could not be more excited about today's video because I get to talk to a dear and longtime friend, Robert Jackman, who I met years ago in a men's group where both of us decided we wanted to be better men and knew that it required some inner reflection, deep emotional digging, and healing. Bob Jackman is the author of a book that I could not recommend more. He is a wonderful therapist, incredible writer, and a healer par excellence. Let me introduce Bob. Bob, can you talk a little bit more about what you do and your background?
So I'm a psychotherapist. I have a practice based in St. Charles, Illinois. The information that I put in the book really is a process that takes the reader through understanding, this idea of unhealed, unresolved childhood wounding and how that shows up in our adult life. And so it's a process that I take people step by step. A lot of it is what I experienced in my own therapy and what I've gathered going to workshops, weekend retreats, and really pulling in all of this material to really create this robust healing process. What my book really focuses on is helping people really identify the areas of wounding that they're carrying into their adult life. The first part of the book is looking at these what I call impulsive reactions or wounded reactions that we all developed in childhood as a response to what was going on in our family of origin. We can reference this as our codependency or codependency skills, as I call them.
Right.
But these are the unique tools that we develop to emotionally survive our dysfunctional families growing up. And so when people are reading the first part of the book, they're really identifying how they might be overcompensating or shutting down, or they might be escaping into drugs or alcohol, or they're being passive aggressive. I have a whole list of all of these different, what I call wounded tools or the impulsive tools, that when they get triggered, they go back and they pull up these impulsive reaction tools. And that's how they're really responding in their adult relationships. So they're getting lost. That's how the wounded or the lost inner child is showing up in their adult life. I'll have people, react, let's say, in a big overreaction to something. And later, and I've done this too, and later you'll say, why did I react so big? Well, that probably was the lost inner child that's showing up in the adult life, because that wounded, lost inner child is saying, I'm here to protect you. And so that's how it shows up in our adult life. And then people are really confused. Why did I react or respond that way?
I'm really interested, as is my YouTube community, on how your techniques or the work that you have created and written about impact people who identify with being codependent or what I call self-love deficient.
That's a great question. Really, the first part is identifying what we're doing in our relationships. So the first part is identifying how these impulsive reactions are showing up, because a lot of people, they don't consciously even know how that impulsive reaction is happening. Right. They're just on autopilot. And so that's really the first part of the book, is identifying that, understanding how over time, in your vernacular, the self-love deficit disorder, how they embodied that, how they walk with those wounded tools, the codependency skills, because they develop them at such a young age to help them cope. And so it feels natural. It feels like a second skin to them. When they start to really identify, okay, these are things I'm doing, this is how it's showing up, and this is how it's affecting my adult relationships. That really is the process, the first process. And then it's about really looking at, okay, where did this come from? Where did this begin? What does this tie back to? And although that might seem, for a lot of people, they'll say, I don't know where this came from, because it just seems like a part of, for myself, it just seemed like, well, this is what I do. I would be the peacemaker, the caretaker. I would try to be perfect so other people wouldn't be mad at me. Those were all the ways that I wasn't loving myself, the ways that I was putting myself second and others first. So identifying what's happening, how that wounded impulsive reaction is showing up, and then going back and looking at our childhood. And I take people through a timeline process, birth to 20, where they're identifying what I call the age of wounding. So the age of wounding really encapsulates how all of these wounded experiences from childhood are, in many cases, it could be one event, or it could be an event or a theme that happens over time within the childhood development. Some people will say, I didn't have one thing that happened, but when it comes down to it, what I find often is that they didn't have one thing that happened that was really traumatic or big, but they had a consistent pattern where in their family of origin childhood, where they were put down or disregarded or disrespected. And over time, that set them up as a template for how they related to themselves and others. And that's what really ties into your book, because that's what really sets up this sort of victim mentality that people will carry, that their attachment trauma that they then carry into their adult life.
And I can't say enough praise about your book. It's different from my work and goes about it in very similar ways. We as psychotherapists, we do best when we represent our own processes, our own healing paths. Yeah. And I know you so well. I know that your book represents what you develop through your own life, through your own practice. What I call my Hitch method, my Healing the Inner Trauma Child method, which one day will be a book, but for now are just my seminars. We similarly try to help our clients understand these hidden, unconscious, or sometimes disassociated parts of themselves that are responsible for their self-sabotaging relationship choices. What I do bears a lot of resemblance to what you do. I trace back that person's development back through all the different stages, going all the way back to their childhood, and help them actually, in a very real way, help them get to know that child inside of them, that lost part of themselves that was hurt and traumatized. In a very powerful and emotionally evocative way, help them connect to those feelings, those memories, the trauma, which was so painful they couldn't manage. And through the discussion and the connection that my client has with their introduction to the child that they used to be, they're able to sort this out. They're able to understand that which they were never healthy enough to even contemplate, and to go through the grief and the pain, to talk about its impact on them, to be allowed to be angry, sad, to emote and express the pain that they didn't even know they had. And through this process is to get to know a lost part of themselves, their lost inner child. And through this process is to get to know themselves. And how do you do the same thing? Because when I read your book, I thought, wow, we kind of do the same thing. We just kind of go about it a different way. What are some of the techniques or tools or assignments, or just the unique Bob Jackman way of doing things to help people?
That's a great question. And much like your work, my work is very dynamic in that I just was describing the other day to someone that, reading my book is kind of like going to therapy, because it's teaching.
Yes, it is.
Right. It's teaching the reader how to be introspective. It's teaching the reader how to go deeper within themselves. It's not a substitute for therapy, but it's really teaching that process that people learn in therapy to go deeper within themselves. The process that I take people through is to go deeper within themselves and really examine themselves in a different way, to observe themselves with a gentle focus rather than being a shame-based focus or being hard on themselves, but just observing and holding everything that they've experienced and how that's contributed to where they are today, to really honor that. Because the inner child that we have inside of us has worked so hard to protect us, especially in childhood. And so what's happening in adulthood is, when triggered, that lost inner child is stepping in front of the adult self, protecting us once again, because we haven't developed enough skills to protect ourselves. So that's a really key point, because once we develop boundary skills, and so chapter 4 and chapter 6 of my book are all about boundaries. Once we develop healthy boundaries, the lost inner child feels safe and doesn't feel like he or she needs to come forth to protect us anymore. That begins the big transformational healing turning point. And that's really what my book is designed to help people get a level of recognition of what's going on, how it's showing up, doing the timeline work, identifying an age of wounding, rating a level of intensity for that age of wounding, and then beginning to do letter writing, connecting with the lost inner child so that they can expand upon that and say, okay, I see, I understand how this is repeatedly showing up in my life. I'm understanding that what helped me in childhood doesn't help me anymore in adulthood. It's hurting me in adulthood. When people begin to really connect that, that's when the shift happens.
Until we know what happened to us in a way that is emotionally visceral, in a way that connects us to not only the memories that have been blocked off or scrubbed clean of affect or feelings, until we fully understand the child's life, the person we used to be, we are the wounded adult carrying the wounded child whose voice has been muted, who has been locked up in a lead concrete encased room, knowing that to express his or her voice would be dangerous. They shut down. They had to shut down because, if we understand post-traumatic stress disorder, if something is so unsafe and so dreadfully painful to remember, the brain makes a decision to save you from that pain and it shuts it down. That analogously is the dungeon or the room in which our trauma child is, or the lost inner child. And my hitch work allows that child to have a voice. It actually opens up the door and we listen to that child. And through that, and through the child's recollections of what they finally feel safe enough to talk about, the adult, my client, can now think about, experience the raw emotions that they didn't know they had, let alone didn't feel safe. And
they're no longer frozen.
Frozen, exactly.
Right.
That's
You know what I say is frozen, because they're no longer kind of lost or frozen, because your process, my process, takes people through this gentle opening up. What I say is that my process doesn't change people. It really expands you. So it's not going to change you. It's going to expand you. It's going to expand your awareness of you. And the metaphor that I use is that the lost inner child is with us all the time, just waiting to step in front of us when it's triggered by the same thing that triggered us in childhood. So because there's an emotionally frozen part of us, I say that there's a part of us that's emotionally frozen, like in a snow globe, that hasn't advanced with the rest of us. It's sort of trapped in time. And so this process helps to kind of unfreeze that, I guess we could say, in a way where we're going back and we're saying, okay, this is what I did then. This helped me then, but it's not helping me now. It's hurting me now. Right. It's hurting my relationships, and I can't maintain friendships, or I can't maintain a job, or I have this negative self-talk that I use with myself over and over and over. There are all these ways.
Sorry to interrupt you, Bob, but you said something that I wanted to talk a little bit about. Is this whole idea of frozen. I remember back in the 80s, the late 80s, when I came out of graduate school, and like many therapists, was at the beginning stages of learning how to do what we do. I accidentally stumbled upon what I would later call the inner trauma child, and I didn't know what was happening. It was like I had hypnotized a person, which incidentally, I had taught myself how to do when I was a teenager, and had stopped doing it, in my early 20s. But it was like I had hypnotized a person, brought her back to these memories of the child. But what I found fascinating was I was talking to the child, the person, the voice, the tenor, the mannerisms, and I didn't yet have a name for it, but I knew something was happening, and it kind of scared me, if I was honest, because I didn't know what I was doing in the beginning, and my supervisor didn't, and they didn't have the internet. Google, I don't know if it was even around in 1988, but I found this book by David Grove, and that talked about trauma and the healing of it. And without going into a lot of details, he referred to what I call the inner trauma child's experience as being frozen at the time that preceded the abuse, the neglect, the abandonment.
Yeah.
And he called that T-1, frozen right before, so that they didn't have to carry the memory, the experience forward. And if you didn't find a therapist that could actually find a path back to that child, find a path into the deeper recesses of our mind, our psychological processes, you couldn't meet that person's fractured off self. So yes, I completely agree with this idea that people get frozen at the time of their trauma. It's people, therapists like yourself and me and other celebrated and brilliant therapists that do similar work, it's our job to trace back the path that goes to the beginning, the genesis of the freezing is to go back to the genesis of the event. Or with attachment trauma, unlike post-traumatic stress disorder, it's not an event. It's not a series of events. It's a large chunk of someone's life is to go back to it. And through our own methods and techniques is to unfreeze the child, introduce that child to the adult that they became so that they don't keep perpetrating on themselves the dysfunctional responses that were learned in childhood that have created their pain as adults.
What I say is that our work is really based on so many people that have come before us that have done a lot of work in the inner child. So we have a lot of wealth of material that we're bringing into our work, and we're pouring this into our books, and we're teaching people who are coming to see us how to do this. So there's a lot of fundamentally strong theoretical information that all of this work is based upon. The key point I want to make is that it's not complicated to do. When you get down to it, it's about anyone who's reading my book, your book, they know their life. So that when they read this process, when they go through the process, they're applying, okay, yes, I do this, I don't do that. And in each chapter of my book, I have stories of real people who have seen me over the years, who gave me permission to use their stories.
Right.
And people can read their story and see, it's like, okay, this is how this person's inner child was showing up in their adult life. And this is how they dealt with it. This is how they worked through it. And a lot of times they'll be struggling with, well, I don't know my age of wounding. I don't know, if there was anything that happened to me as a child. And then we'll talk a little bit more, and I take people through in the book, I'll do this with them, where I'm asking, it's like, okay, so nothing big happened, but there are some themes that keep on showing up in your life. That's really the inner child wounding, are the wounded themes that happen over and over.
It's as interesting as it is of how similar our approaches are. I think a key difference, and I would not say a qualitative difference, because if my community doesn't know this already, and which I hope they do, the measure of a good therapist is not being like another therapist that you want or like, but is to find a way to solve a person's problems that are congruent with their own experience in life, their own viewpoints, their own understanding. And you do a masterful job at molding your own journey and molding a book out of your own journey. But one of the key differences is my Hitch method moves a person, and analogously or similarly than hypnosis, but it's not hypnosis, but it's a method that moves a person into part of their brain where the memory of the pain has been cordoned off, locked off. If we think of post-traumatic stress disorder, where someone was in combat and lost their best friend in a horribly agonizing way, and that memory was blocked off so that they wouldn't have to feel or remember or go through the pain. Well, attachment trauma shares that characteristic, that the pain, the agony of it is so significant that remembering it is dangerous. That is why the brain evolved its capacity to disassociate, forget, or freeze out such trauma. Right. And through my methods, analogous to hypnosis, I bring a person back and actually introduce them to the child they were. As hard as it is to explain, it's a very real and emotionally tangible experience. And it's through that discussion we're talking about, we're recollecting, we're resolving. It's like doing therapy with a child. The child, the inner trauma child, knows that their adult self is present in this discussion. And the child and the adult talk to each other. And there is this dialogue over time, and it's usually just not one session, where the child discloses safely and progressively or incrementally what happened. And through the discussion of the three of us, the inner trauma child, the adult, and myself, there is resolution, there is integration. What really draws me to your book is your work does not require intensive, deep, and in some ways, potentially unsafe psychotherapy. And I must say unsafe in the hands of a practitioner who doesn't know what they're doing. But your work is brilliant because you understand the same psychological processes as I do. And I know this because we've had many a discussion, but you found a way to walk a person through your own set of techniques so that they can get the same information, the same trauma integration through this very persuasive, feelings-rich, emotionally evocative psychoeducational process of through your techniques, through your exercises, through your workbook. I'd love to hear more about how you connect to the frozen child's recollection of what happened to free them of their dysfunctional choices, habits, and self-sabotaging ways. Can you talk more about how the identification of the themes connects people to the part of what's frozen for the purpose of unlocking, or whatever terminology you use, unlocking their, or changing, or identifying their dysfunctional processes or habits or patterns?
Well, this is really, this comes down to if you can name it, you can claim it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can really identify what's happening over and over in your life, if you can zero in on that and you can rate a level of frequency or an intensity to it, that's going to really point you to some events that happen in childhood of where that probably originated from. So through a number of exercises, I take people through a number of exercises where they're identifying, okay, this is what I say to myself, this is what I do. And it's like, okay, well, where did that come from?
Right.
Because we're not born with these self-limiting ideas of ourselves. We learn them. Either they were put directly onto us, or we inferred that based on how people were treating us. And so it's learning how to look at ourselves objectively and say, okay, where did this come from? Why do I do this? And then from that, then we can translate that, okay, this is how it shows up in my adult life. I've created a number of exercises that the reader can go through to help them identify not only the wounded impulsive reactions that they developed as a child, how they show up in their adult life, but then I take them through a process of symbolic healing letter writing.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Where the inner child writes to the adult self. So this is after the really important timeline part where the reader goes back and identifies things that happen in emotionally significant things that happen in childhood from birth to 20, and then rating a level of intensity on those, and then coming up with an age of wounding. So for example, I was talking with someone the other day, and she was telling me about her childhood. Her parents divorced at 14. And for her, a lot of things shifted at 14. And she said she was no longer the same person. Mm-hmm. So that was a really big clue right there that she was giving to herself and to me, where she was saying, I was no longer the same person after that. And so I said, well, that could be one of your age of woundings.
Right.
It's from that, I'm having her write a letter from her 14-year-old self to her adult self, and then her adult self writes back to her 14-year-old self.
And I think that's how our processes are aligning. You just kind of go at it in a different way. I love it. Right. Just continue.
Right, because that's such an important part, because that's when we're giving voice to the inner child. So people will say, well, I don't know how to write, from my 14-year-old's perspective. And I'll say, you know exactly what happened at that time. Mm-hmm. The feelings that you had, the events that you were going through. I said, just really channel that information. And so they'll write the letters, and then the adult self writes back in a very caring, loving, responsive way everything that we as children at that age would have loved to have heard. And through that process, that's when a lot of healing is occurring. And so we have that acknowledgement of the wounded, lost inner child saying, okay, this is how I was hurt, and this is what I developed because I was hurt in this way to protect myself. And what the adult self is saying, it's like, okay, I get it, but I'm, as an adult now, I'm learning boundaries. I'm learning how to protect myself and protect all of us. So you, the lost inner child, doesn't need to show up in the same way anymore.
Right.
Thank you for all those ways that you have shown up, but you don't need to do that anymore. You don't need to exhaust yourself trying to protect us over and over and over. And then the next stage is the integration, is once the inner child really understands, okay, the adult self, he or she's got it, he or she can set boundaries, and I don't have to work so hard to protect us. Then the inner child begins to integrate with the adult self. And that integration is really the big healing moment.
And we work really hard as psychotherapists to get to that moment of integration, because that is when there is a convergence of understanding emotionally and intellectually, when our client can finally make the connection of why they keep hurting themselves while trying in their mind to just survive, and to see these patterns, the symbolic patterns, and to consciously choose to not only protect themselves from their own sabotaging ways, but to recognize these patterns never were meant to be helpful, but just to be used as a suffering child to survive.
They were survival tools. They were our emotional survival tools. So they worked for us then. But what happens is we put them in our toolbox and we carry them into adulthood. And we're like, okay, well, this is what's in my toolbox. So I'm just going to keep on using them. And I'll use them with my partner. I'll use them with my colleagues. I'll use them with friends. But they're not designed for that. They were designed for childhood wounding.
Absolutely.
And we just subconsciously carry that into adulthood.
Yes, absolutely. And as I write about and talk about in my Hitch video, that we keep doing what we thought worked for us as children. And the sad reality is, if you're a child enduring attachment trauma, which typically includes having a pathologically narcissistic parent and potentially one that is self-love deficient or codependent, is you are fighting really hard to get any morsel or crumb of love, respect, and caring, affirmation. And if you're fortunate, you figure out a way to survive the trauma. And so these coping mechanisms, these survival strategies, they had a place in your childhood. And probably without them, things would have been worse. But as an adult, their impact on making you feel better, making you healthier, making you get the love, respect, and caring you need is limited, if not downright bad.
Ultimately, they're self-destructive. My process is about helping people recognize how to move from being an unconscious, impulsive reactor to being a conscious creator in your life. So you don't have to just go on autopilot based on stuff that, well, I've done this before, so I'm just going to do this again. Well, that's how people stay in bad relationships. That's how they keep on recreating basically the same sort of wounded patterns that they had in childhood, because they've just brought the same tools into their adult life. They keep using them over and over and over. Yeah.
I'm personally fascinated, and always have been, with how you see the world and your approach to making people healthier and happier and more self-loving.
Well, thank you. I always enjoy our discussions, Ross, and I always come away feeling very filled up and very encouraged, and just there's a great validation, that we have, because we see the world similarly, but through our own lens.
And that is why I so much cherish our relationship and have such high respect for you. And it's also why I endorse your book with such enthusiasm. Please, folks, check it out. You're going to get another powerful, another evocative, inspiring story, explanation, and direction on solving the pain that keeps creating the pain that you don't want, that is so sabotaging. Any closing thoughts that you'd like to tell our community?
I would really like people to know that that this work is very accessible, that I wrote my book in a very easy to read way.
Yes.
And I purposely did not put a lot of jargon in it because I wanted people to be able to pick up the book, easily go through and read it and do the exercises, and to really trust yourself and to know that you're stronger than you think, and that healing is available to you, that just going through the process, you're going to learn a lot about yourself. You're going to be able to heal big parts of yourself that you've carried for so long that no longer serve you.
Right.
And so that expanded version of yourself is waiting for you. And Ross, I really appreciate this opportunity to be with you today, but also to talk about my book. And thank you for all the wonderful things you said about my book and my work. I really appreciate that so much.
Okay, so let me close this video by reading my endorsement that I wrote for your book. And the reason I want to share that is because I think it accurately portrays my experience with it. Robert Jackman's Healing Your Lost Inner Child is a rare find among the tens of thousands of self-help books. Jackman brilliantly communicates his original ideas, concepts, and clinical direction while staying true to cutting-edge information on the subject of trauma resolution. Those suffering from attachment trauma will feel enveloped by Jackman's authentic and highly relatable passion for the subject. Readers will be forever transformed by his understanding of complex trauma and his coherent instruction on how to solve it. This brilliant book instills optimism and courage to dig deep into the shame-stained areas of your life so that you can heal. And that, my friend, captures this book. So I could not be more fortunate that my friend Robert Jackman, my fellow therapist and fellow author, has put something out that I respect so deeply and dearly and agreed to have this conversation. So Bob, thank you so much. And I look forward to more videos that we can do together.
Thank you, Ross. I would love that. Thank you for being my friend. Thank you for the endorsement. And thank you for this opportunity to share my work with all of your followers. And I look forward to more collaborations.
Excellent. Take care.
Take care.